Uh, Good evening. I'm Robert Kesten, Executive Director of Stonewall National Museum and Archives here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And I just want to ask you, if you're on Zoom or if you're on Facebook, to please consider joining us and going to the website and filling out the forms, and consider also that we are an archive, and an archive should be a living and breathing entity. And to do that, we need your stuff. We need things that tell your story, because our stories are what makes us unique, but also makes us part of a community that is larger than ourselves. So please go to stonewall-museum.org and become a member. Membership's not very expensive, but it really helps us a great deal do this kind of work. And consider donating your ephemera, your books, your papers, your materials that you believe are important to the story of the LGBTQ community. Today we have Zak Salih. I don't know, how do you pronounce your last name?
Yep, you got it.
Okay.
Salih, yeah.
And his book, Let's Get Back to the Party. I don't know if it comes out backwards here, but nonetheless, his first novel, and it has to do with a couple of young guys that live in and around Washington, D.C. They met as children. There are many years that go by in between this very intense early friendship, when Oscar, one of the protagonists, who lives in a family that's quite uncomfortable, spends a lot of time with Sebastian, whose family is much more conventional and welcoming. And so Oscar sort of finds a home with Sebastian and his parents, and then is abruptly moved when his father gets a job elsewhere and uproots the family to follow that job. And then they don't see each other for many years until they're in college. And I think one of the telling tales of this novel is that Sebastian sees Oscar and immediately recognizes him. Oscar, on the other hand, sort of doesn't even recognize this young man who was his best friend as a child, and who in some ways gave him a sense of what life could be. So why don't you take it from there and tell us, how did you come up with the characters and what do they represent to you?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. It's a real treat to be able to talk with you, and thank you for the mission of your organization. It's all too more important, especially now. I don't think I need to say any more than that. So the real engine of this novel, to me, is what is it like to be part of a kind of hinge generation of gay men, a generation of gay men to which I belong to. So men in their mid-30s, but men who for whom the AIDS plague and you know the crisis and all the years of protest and activism aren't lived memory, but in a sense just history. But also on the other end, what is it like to not have grown up in a time that I think we are increasingly seeing more and more of, where there's a lot more acceptance, certainly a lot more visibility, and what does it feel like to kind of be trapped in between those, and how does one react? And so in the characters of Oscar and Sebastian, I really wanted to explore two of the very extremes of an admittedly very diverse and very broad spectrum, and see what happened when they kind of came into conflict with one another, and with members of these kind of preceding and succeeding generations, and how do they cope with that? I think in all the very kind of messy, obtuse ways that human beings have about coping with things that kind of frighten them, particularly the passing of time. And so, yeah, I wrote this novel not as a coming out narrative, as important as those narratives are, I think I was more interested in what is it like to come into a community, right? A community with a past, a community with a future. How does one carve their own space? How does one cultivate their own kind of joy and mission and values in the context, I think, of so much history? And if it's okay with you, Robert, I think maybe this might be a good time to kind of read a brief excerpt from the book to give people a sense of kind of these two characters and their voices.
Please go ahead.
Great. So the book oscillates between Oscar and Sebastian's perspectives and their voices, which are very strikingly different. I even wanted the way in which their story was told to kind of visually appear different on the page and to kind of reflect their emotional states. So about midway through the book, it's Sebastian, as Robert, or Oscar, excuse me, as Robert alluded to, is someone who had a very difficult family life. So I suppose it's no spoiler to say that his father dies midway through the novel, and his estranged father, and he's summoned back to Ohio for the funeral. And so this is where we find him. The viewing is modest. A few family members, some aunts and uncles, cousins so young they've no idea who I could possibly be, friends from my father's church, a few lost souls trucked in from Holly House. I see them staring at me, feel them watching me while I stand next to my mother, while I shake their hands, while I thank them for their sympathies. The rumor made flesh. They're all polite in that genial Midwestern way, these people, but I can see their insecurity, their confusion, their disgust. Good, be disgusted. The feeling's mutual. Behind me, Harrison Burnham lies in repose in his coffin, face shiny and seamless like one of the plastic comic book action figures Sebastian and I used to play with in the sunroom of his parents' house. His hands are clasped over his crotch, the way he'd often hold them in life while watching me stumble through soccer games or waiting while I got a haircut. Thick, proud hands I recall faintly, cutting grilled chicken breasts into more manageable squares, pulling the television remote out of my hands when it was time for bed, applying bandages and ointments. Hands that also slapped and spanked, that slammed on countertops in fits of anger whose unspoken cause I always felt was me. They remind me to look at them now of another pair of hands. Hands that grip glass after glass of scotch, that used to chuck me on the chin and now can't be bothered to respond to my texts and emails and calls. Hello, Oscar, Aunt Emma says. How have you been? Good, I say. Hi, Oscar, my mother's work friend Lucy says. And how are things? Fine, I say. Oscar, the pastor says, keeping those fools in Washington honest? Trying to, I say. 2 miles south, the afternoon skies hold off on their threat of rain, long enough for us to bury my father. The cemetery is a modest acre of flat land lying in the shadow of a water tower. My father's casket stands on its bier over the pit into which, once we've turned our backs, it'll be lowered. To his right, there's a bare patch of grass that one day will open to receive my mother, the two of them sandwiched for eternity between Michael Blas and Peter and Janet Menkitty. There's no space, I see, for me. One by one, we come and drop flowers on the casket. My mother looks at me as I toss mine onto the pile and smiles. Through a gap in the fake turf by my feet, I see the grave itself, a horrible darkness, and I have to step away from the group and walk off until I find a stone bench on whose seat is engraved the words, when someone you love becomes a memory, the memory becomes a treasure. Across from me, a small headstone reads Alan Talbot, beloved son, 1964 to 1992. Not even 30 years old. Cancer, perhaps? A brief illness? Were you disowned as well, Alan Talbot, beloved son? Did you come home to die, or did they have to ship you back here? If you see my father down there, Alan Talbot, beloved son, tell him I don't need his prayers. Tell him, with respect, I won't die like you, buried in shame under mounds of dirt. No, tell him I'll die out loud. Tell him I'll die on fire. And then a little bit later, so Sebastian is a high school art history and English teacher, and he also sponsors the Queer Student Union at his high school. And over time develops a friendship with one of the students there, a very precocious student, senior named Arthur Ayer. And they discover that they share a love of film. And so they start watching movies together after class in the classroom. And that's where this brief excerpt picks up. I began to stay late at work, later than usual, grading practice exams, making up for the time I lost watching films with Arthur. Cool spring air came in through the open windows of the trailer, carrying with it the call and cry of lacrosse players from the nearby fields. At 7:30, I looked up from my desk and started when I saw Arthur sitting there. No, not Arthur. His purple hoodie draped on the back of a desk chair. I walked over and looked down at the garment, felt the tenderness of the trailer's floor under my feet, imagined the body, more familiar to me now in the past several weeks, fitting inside the limp sleeves. Limbs full of youth and vigor, limbs that defended their owner from bullies, limbs that curled around the waist of another boy. The Caravaggio kid and his fleshy Caravaggio body. I looked around, then tried to put the hoodie on. It was far too small. I carried the garment over to my work bag as if it were the drapery of a long dead saint. I'd take it home, give it to Arthur the next day. No sense in some errant janitor thinking it was up for grabs. I thought about it for the rest of the evening, while finishing up my grading, while driving home through a rain shower, while eating a sandwich in the living room and watching the television replicate the same news stories I'd seen on my computer and phone all day. A missing senior citizen in Gaithersburg. Protests outside the old post office with its banner reading Trump coming 2016, the week's second dead celebrity. While taking my evening shower, while making my final rounds of the house, checking locks, checking lights, checking windows, while unmaking the bed, while stacking the decorative pillows in a perilous pile on the floor. Then I did it. I took the second pillow, the same one Jake used to rest his head on, this is his ex-boyfriend, and turned it so it lay on the bed like a torso. I went to the kitchen table where the hoodie lay folded and carried it, so heavy now, into the bedroom. Then, as if dressing an infant or dying parent, I slipped the hoodie around the pillow, pulled up the zipper, and folded back the empty sleeves. I stepped back for a moment to see what I'd done, to admire the strange, limbless trunk. Then I got into bed, turned off the light, and after several moments lying still in the dark, wrapped my right arm around the lower half of the pillow and pulled it into me. I took a greedy breath. A cologne I couldn't properly place, bargain basement laundry detergent, mild sweat, a musk like cigarette smoke, maybe Raymond's. I thought of the boyfriend who once dipped his head into a Wednesday group meeting but otherwise kept to himself, who mostly met Arthur afterward. Several times I caught them holding hands while walking to Mr. Ayer's waiting car. This, I thought, clutching the pillow, is what it must be like for Raymond to bury his face into Arthur's head of hair, to hold his tired body, to know him in a way I never could and never would. Cutting through the shame of all this was an envy so sharp and jagged it could easily be mistaken for rage. I wanted Arthur. No, I wanted to be Arthur, because if I were Arthur, I wouldn't be myself. If I had his life, then I wouldn't have to have my own. Thinking of the two boys slumped into one another on the living room couch watching the movies I'd recommended, I clutched the pillow tighter. Outside, rain drummed against the bedroom windows like a warning. The next afternoon, I returned the hoodie. You left this in class yesterday, I said. Without a word, Arthur shrugged the hoodie over his body. I caught a slice of belly, a thinner slice of green underwear. I was tense as I led the class through another round of practice questions and identification drills. Title the work, name the artist, date the piece, describe the style, identify the movement. I expected Arthur to sniff some lingering scent of what I'd done, expected him to get up on his desk like an Edgar Allan Poe maniac and stab me with an accusatory finger. Arthur, in his purple hoodie, stared at the front of the room with sleepy eyes. He has no idea, I thought, no idea at all. I couldn't decide whether I was more relieved or hurt by this. Thank you.
Well, they are definitely different.
Yeah.
They see the world completely differently.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting that out of their youthful experience of toys, shared toys, collectibles, that they would grow so far apart in terms of what they wanted, what they needed, but yet in their own ways, they sort of still see the world in a similar way, as a place that's not comfortable,
Yeah.
as a place where they're, if not targeted, still made to feel not part of.
Right. I think you're absolutely right, Robert. Yeah.
Neither of them feel. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, and I think for me, one of the interesting things I was trying to accomplish with this project is that discomfort comes from, in some respects, within their own community, right? And not necessarily from outside, right? Like the things they want to be, they're feared by their peers of being judged, or they're feared of being misunderstood by their peers, or there's, you know, a chance for a lot of antagonism. I mean, Sebastian is very much someone who wants a stable monogamous relationship, who wants to settle down, who wants to have kids. But for someone like Oscar, it's a very kind of who kind of aspires to be a kind of more of a radical queer, even though he does it in very kind of pathetic ways throughout the book. To him, that's, you know, that's conformity. That to him, that is kind of the antithesis of the very project of queerness that this 60-something writer who he develops a friendship with and starts to admire, kind of wrote about. So I think a lot of the kind of antagonism in the book, for me, it was important that it was between these two gay men, right? And not an antagonism that was kind of set upon them necessarily by their outside kind of heteronormative community, I think, in ways that we're kind of familiar with reading about, if that makes sense.
It does, but what I think was most interesting was that most of their discomfort came from within them.
Sure, absolutely.
It wasn't that people were, I mean, reading it, it doesn't come across that many people were spending any time thinking about them or judging them.
I mean, such is the danger of writing a narrative in the first person, right? And spending several hundred pages trapped in someone's head.
But they were largely ignored by their peers. Yes, their friends liked them and their friends included them. And they both had very different sets of friends. But there's never really a moment where their friends attack them or challenge them, except the older writer definitely does later, but that's after he's dead.
Well, they're judged in a way, without kind of giving too much away. I mean, they're judged in a way by the generations that precede and succeed them, right? They are judged and they are found wanting. Sebastian is found wanting in a way by Arthur, his student. They have a confrontation, and then, as you alluded to, Oscar and Sean have a confrontation as well. I mean, so it's really the novel is really built on these four characters. So I wanted it to be kind of like a kind of emotional chamber piece. It's not meant to be some kind of vast sociological, you know, some kind of grand cast of characters. It's very much at least my intention was, and my hope was, a much more kind of modest character study, I think.
And I think that you accomplished that. I think that the focus is very clearly on the two of them, and the other characters illuminate the difficulties that they have, not necessarily with society as much as with themselves.
Exactly. And, you know, it's funny, I had flirted, you know, kind of early on in kind of planning and kind of drafting and revising this book with opening the novel up and with having us inside the heads of Sean the writer and Arthur the student, and I tried it for a bit, but then I think what I lost was that focus on Oscar and Sebastian, and in a sense, it's not about the character of the writer and the student, you know, these two different kind of generations that kind of entrap Oscar and Sebastian. It's really about how they react to them, how they envy them, how they objectify them, how these characters end up disappointing them in ways that are not because they've done anything evil, but because they're human, and I think human beings are complex. And when we see people, right, we're only seeing a certain part of them. It's very akin to like looking at a work of art in a museum. There's a lot of objectification, I think, that goes on with that kind of viewing. And so to open it up to you know, these other kind of generational figures, I felt like a lot of that was lost, in the ways that we can fixate on someone and desire someone and kind of idealize someone. But, you know, like I said, they end up disappointing us for no other reason than that they're human. And by being human, they run counter to this kind of one-dimensional, you know, I guess, pedestal that we've put them up on.
But do you not find that it also has to do with the fact that neither of them are well adjusted? Their lack of adjustment is very often the cause of the friction between them and the people that they want to be close with.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I mean, my argument is just that, you know, I think emotionally, like we said before, you know, I think emotionally stable people are not very interesting in fiction. They're the kind of people I prefer to spend my time with in real life. But I think when I'm in the middle of a book, whether it's writing it or reading it, I just think there's so much richness that comes from, you know, the quote unquote messy gaze, right? And kind of emotionally, I don't know, it was just very kind of, it captivated me. I felt like there was more kind of fertile ground there to explore these kind of ideas. And you bring up a very good point, because there's an argument to be made. You know, I'm open to the idea that people should read this book however they like. But these two men are you know, very self-loathing at times. I think they, you know, they lack that kind of sense of confidence and self-esteem that I think is required of you know, maturity. You know, that's kind of the overarching dilemma, right, of any coming of age story is how are these characters going to come of age, and what if they don't? You know, I kind of wanted it to be very open-ended, because I think the sad truth is, you know, some people just don't change. I think you know, that's, to me, it's very disturbing, but it's also very enriching. You know, because we assume we go through an entire narrative and at the end the character changes, but you know.
Well, they did, but they didn't change necessarily the way one might expect. But the other thing that was interesting is, in their self-loathing or lack of respect for themselves, they made themselves in their own minds more important to the other two characters that you've mentioned than they might have been actually to those other two characters.
Right.
And part of their devastation is that they weren't more important to them.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's no question that Arthur wouldn't have taken Sebastian's hoodie and put it over his pillow.
Yeah. How often do students care about the interior lives of their teachers, right?
Or even think of them as really human.
Yeah. Again, going back to this kind of idealization of people. Not necessarily an idealization, but certainly a flattening. And a flattening and a loss of perspective, I think.
And that's why Sebastian's idolizing the youth of Arthur and the freedom that he perceived that Arthur had became much bigger than how Arthur fit Sebastian into his life. And the same was true with Oscar and Sean. As Oscar saw that Sean had written multiple books and lived in New York and all of this stuff, being able to say that Sean was his friend was important. But in reality, Sean didn't look at Oscar that way.
Yeah.
Of course, we don't find that until later in the book, but nonetheless, Oscar is sort of diminished when he learns how he was that he was really a subject rather than the friend that he thought he was.
Yeah. And that it's interesting that you use that word diminishment, because I think that is another part of maturity and growth, right? Is a loss of one's specialness. One is just a tiny part of the larger human community, and one is the kind of if there could be an arc to maturity, I guess you could roughly say it's a transition from an I state of mind to a we state of mind, right? It's not about the self so much as it is about the community. I think this is particularly important to the queer community. So I think there is, with that loss of that loss of kind of singularity, I think you're absolutely right. There is kind of a diminishment. But if one were to look at it, responsibly, there is also an enrichment, right? To become from, playing a part or being a member of such a vibrant community. But of course, if they thought about that from the start, these characters, there'd be no book and we wouldn't be here discussing it.
So if there was something that you wanted people to take away, what would that be?
How to and how not to cope with the passing of time. I think that would probably be something to, I'm not really on board with the idea of fiction as necessarily being, a tool for moral instruction.
I'm not even suggesting that.
No. I know you're not. I'm talking my way through my own thoughts. But I think, yeah, this book is really as kind of unabashedly gay as it is. It's been very much about, to me, in the writing of it, and I know in the reception of it from other people I've been privileged to talk with, it's really just about, it's about the passing of time, and I think, and how terrifying that can be. I think what it does to preceding generations, this kind of fear of being forgotten, I think, or of kind of being ignored, I think, or of being relegated to, no pun intended, to an archive. And the responsibility that one has is to acknowledge that history and to respect it. And I think that both of these characters really struggle with that. There's a beautiful line by Rebecca Solnit that I think really kind of encapsulates this, and she says, the art is not in forgetting but in letting go. And I think that is a very, that is kind of a huge dilemma. How do we remember without obsessing? How do we respect and honor, while also, trying to find joy in our own, existence, which is not planned, which is entirely accidental, the circumstances of our birth, right, and the time and place in which one is born. How does one find joy in that, and how does one also acknowledge and respect what came before, and also what's going to come after you, right? Like every generation is at one point the future. It's considered the future. Then it becomes the present, and eventually it's the past. And I think that is unavoidable for everyone. And I think that can be very terrifying.
I would certainly agree that if you, at some point it's terrifying, at some point you are resolved to it, And
Right,
in
right,
the earliest stages, you can't comprehend it.
right. Exactly, exactly.
But who would you say, being this in this conversation, and you brought it up, so I'm going to hold you to the question, being that there is a beginning, a middle, and an end, and history moves through those channels, whose shoulders would you say you stand on?
Oh gosh, you mean like
You
creatively?
you can pick it any way you want.
Existentially, my family, as a gay man, pretty much everyone who is in your archives. Um, Artistically, I mean, my God, there are too many writers to count. Um,
But there's be as specific as you can be. Certainly on the writers.
oh,
Can't
and
be every
no,
it can't be every writer.
Andrew Holleran, absolutely, without a doubt. I think sad literary gays are the best literary gays, and he certainly has the market cornered on that. He's a beautiful writer, and he writes about such deep and admittedly depressing things like death and aging, but in ways that feel very human. You create a fictional gay writer, and everyone kind of has their ideas about who it's based on, and I don't like to debunk any of those because I respect what the reader kind of gets from it or puts upon it, only to say that I certainly had a lot of writers in mind, like Andrew Holleran, like Edmund White, like Larry Kramer. But that honestly, the writer character is in many ways more directly sourced from a good friend of mine who is just a simple bureaucrat and not a writer, just a civil servant in the federal government. But yeah, I would say if there's a writer whose work I aspire to, whose talents I aspire to, whose talents I respect, it's absolutely Andrew Holleran. And here's the beautiful thing, right, about living in such a time where it seems like there are more and more, queer voices, queer literary voices accessible. Is all due respect to Mr. Holleran. Who knows, that might change in a year from now when I read something else, either when I read something that's been published before that I've missed out on. There are certainly admittedly a lot of gaps in my reading knowledge, or voices that are in the process of being published. I've had the good privilege to read a couple manuscripts of novels that are coming out next year by queer writers, and it's great to be alive at a time where it seems to me there are so many voices out there and so many stories that one can read about and so many experiences that one can kind of have, and so many outlets for different forms of empathy. And I think that's why the recent resurgence in book banning is just such an existential battle, right? I mean, what better outlet for empathy is there than literature?
So there's an interesting juxtaposition with more creative works coming out and more people engaging in creative work. At the same time, certain governments, not only here in the United States, but in other parts of the world, are cracking down and trying to prohibit that exuberance, that renaissance.
Right. And there's that kind of, I remember in 2015 when marriage equality was passed, I think and I'm certainly not alone in this, I think for a brief minute thought like, wow, what a victory. Like, this is great. This is it. Like, it's all, downhill from here. And the universe in true fashion always comes up with ways to inventive new ways to push you back, right? To impede your progress. And so I think the struggle is continual. I think it is in some ways, if I were to be very pessimistic about it, perpetual. There will always be people out there who are, interested in silencing your voice, either figuratively or literally. And going back to what I was saying earlier, the project then is how do I, as a member of this community, do my part to join that struggle, but B, knowing that this is the only life I have, how do I cultivate some kind of joy and respect for myself? Because that too, I think, can be a weapon. I mean, it's cliche, but it's true, right? Like the most political act a queer person can do is come out where and when possible. I really do believe that. I think a lot of these things like, where do you vacation? Like, what do you wear? Like, monogamy, polyamory. I mean, these are things that, it's all a la carte, right? Like, take what you want, leave the rest behind, find out whatever suits you. But I, the older I get, I think the more I believe that the only obligations any queer person has is, like I said, to be out where and when possible, and to recognize, I think, as the characters in this novel struggle to do, that one is part of a spectrum of experience and a spectrum of existence, and that, like I said, like sometimes you're the present, sometimes you're the future, and sometimes you're the past, and acknowledging that, and in acknowledging it, respecting it too. Sorry, maybe that was a long-winded answer.
Long-winded sometimes gives you an awful lot of information, which is usually a good thing. So will you ever visit these characters again? Or since you did leave it open-ended for both of them?
Yeah. I have no plans at the moment, but sometimes I think, wouldn't it be nice to meet these men again when they're in their 50s, and then maybe yet again when they're in their 70s, and I can finally aspire to write the Andrew Holleran novel I always want to write. I've thought about it that just kind of on a whim, but in terms of where they are or what they're doing, I have no idea. I'm kind of content to just let them live their lives, and maybe they've changed, maybe they haven't. I think either result, I think, would be certainly somewhat interesting to consider.
And then the other thing is you use water, or the painting of water and water and the view of water a great deal.
Yeah.
And what does that signify for you?
We all came from the ocean, right? That's where we came from. I'll leave it at that.
So, okay, so it's an origin story.
It's an origin story, yeah, for all of humanity.
Well, for all living things.
All living. I mean, look, it's something that's nurturing. It's something that you need to live. It's something that can kill you. It's everywhere. It composes what, 70-something% of the human body. And I mean, I love water. Like, there's a reason why so many of us love the beach, right? Like, we gravitate toward the water, and the writer in me just thinks there's some kind of primal, instinctive need to acknowledge water, I guess.
I mean, you have rain.
You're making me thirsty.
You have rain, you have lakes, rivers, what have you. So it was just interesting how the water, although not a dominant character, is a consistent character throughout the book.
It's the site of endings and beginnings, maybe, might be a way to think about it. That's where beginnings and endings happen. at least maybe kind of in the context of this particular story.
That's interesting. That is an interesting way to use that. There's also a fair amount of weddings, different kinds of weddings.
Mhm.
You use that in some very interesting ways, both as a party and celebratory, and at the same time, the juxtaposition that it is conforming and antithetical to the gay or queer existence,
Mhm.
because it's about fitting in to a society where you don't have to fit into, yet coexist with.
Right, right.
So there's no question that your use of the wedding where Sebastian and Oscar see each other was one kind of wedding. The wedding of Oscar's friends later in the book is a different kind of wedding. Was it a tool, or how do you see it as a way of demonstrating their personalities and the differences between the two men?
Yeah, I think you put it really well, that it's a juxtaposition, and it can be both kind of celebratory and not. I mean, you know, I kind of the thought that I had for this book was, you know, two men are at a wedding, both of them are miserable for entirely different reasons, I think, and that is where the book started. So there was that juxtaposition, and how do Oscar and Sebastian kind of view what about a wedding would make them angry, and that's kind of how that trajectory began. But in a kind of larger historical sense, I mean, the book is structured. It takes place over a year, and it's bookended by the Supreme Court marriage equality ruling, and then a year later, the Pulse nightclub massacre, events which happened, you know, almost a year apart. Which when I kind of realized that, I thought was very eerie, and in a perverse way, as a novelist, very kind of a very fruitful laboratory, I think, in which to explore these two characters and kind of how they interact with each other and in their community. I mean, on the one hand, in the summer of 2015, you have this moment of you know, mass kind of communal celebration, right? And then about a year later, it's you know, it's a kind of mass communal mourning. And I think the ways in which, you know, the universe can just kind of like turn on a dime like that, and that you can be celebrating a triumph one year, and then, or one summer, and then the next be in a collective sense of mourning, and what does that say about, you know, the kind of gains and losses of the gay rights struggle, and but also just in a kind of more universal sense. I mean, we're all living under the shroud of our own demises, right? You know, the universe has kind of a peculiar way of mirroring that. So that's kind of, I was thinking, you know, here's a book that begins with kind of a mass celebratory wedding and ends with kind of a mass collective funeral. And in the space of that is kind of a kind of microcosm of life, perhaps.
But even in this celebratory moment of marriage being approved by the Supreme Court, not everybody saw it as something to celebrate.
Right, exactly. Oscar himself saw it as nothing worth celebrating. Yeah.
So although he was devastated by Pulse, he was not one of those people who was euphoric or felt that we had accomplished an important goal with the Supreme Court decision.
Right, exactly.
And with Sebastian, it was almost saddening as well, because where he thought he would be able to take advantage of that,
Yes.
Due to circumstances beyond his control, he was not able to take advantage of that.
Right. The book begins with him, both of them are in a sense being forced to celebrate something that really sets them off, right? So like it starts at a wedding. Sebastian is technically kind of forced to be there by his friend, and he feels miserable. Oscar is forced to be there by his boss, a kind of sense of professional allegiance. And neither of them both of them feel excluded, right? Like Sebastian feels excluded because this is something he wants, something he wants to participate in, but the circumstances in which begin the novel prohibit him from doing that. This is something that Oscar does not want to participate in, but the circumstances being what they are is kind of forced to participate, even in his own, miserly way. Yeah.
So then it's a double interesting point of contention that the community is celebrating a great victory, and these two members of the community feel pushed out of the only community where they feel that they possibly belong.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And all of their insecurities, all of their encumbrances in that year become magnified because they don't see themselves really belonging anywhere.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And they can't come together in a friendship, the kind of friendship certainly that Sebastian would like, the kind of friendship that, to some extent, Oscar needs.
Right.
Because of the way they feel about themselves.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
So that's, I think, one of the most, for me, enlightening parts of the book is that you can be living in a world with pride, with this, with that, all the things that they go through in the course of that year. And everything that makes or should make you happy, everything that happens that should make you feel part and parcel of something,
mm-hmm.
You find a way to make it the enemy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so many people do that. I mean, you've captured a slice of life that probably everybody goes through at some point in their existence and hopes to get out of,
Mm-hmm.
hopes to find the way to remedy that, hopes to find the thing that makes you feel a little bit whole.
Right. And the dilemma is the solution within oneself, or do we rely on other people to help us get out of there? Right. I mean, you could go both ways. I'm not going to stake my claim on one or the other because honestly, I waffle. There are some days where I think that, I have that classic, mentality that we heard of over and over during the early stages of the pandemic, that we're all in this together. But then there's also another part of me that thinks you're the only one who can save yourself. And that in a strange way is the essence of pride, right? Like you can go to all the most vibrant and exciting parties, but you can still go home and you're by yourself in a room and you hate yourself, right? And I would argue a person like that doesn't necessarily have pride. I mean, to me, the most authentic form of pride is, how do I feel about myself when I'm alone in a room and not in the company of other people? Do I still value myself, or do I feel like I need the company of other people in order to feel whole? And I don't know. Sometimes I think yes, like we're social animals. We need to be around other people. Like, there's nothing kind of, there's no evolutionary advantage to being a misanthrope. Or a shut-in. But it depends. I think, like a lot of things for me personally, it varies day to day. It varies in my moods. Like if I've had a bad interaction with someone in customer service, then I'll think like, no, of course, like we're not all in this together. Like it's just up to me. Or then I spend time like with my friends and I think, yeah, like why would I want to, be in this alone? so it waffles like that, and in the same way that I think any reading of a book kind of waffles, and my hope is that it kind of waffles for the reader as well, like that there's a part of them, I hope, that never really 100% all the time has Oscar and Sebastian completely pegged. I mean, to me, that feels the most authentic representation of a human being, right? Is you can never completely understand another human being, regardless of how intimate you are with them, right? There's a part of them, and I think this is true for Oscar and Sebastian in the way that they perceive Sean the writer and Arthur the student. There's always a part of these people that we fixate on for whatever reason that will always remain kind of unknown and unknowable. There's that to me is a truth, and I think that's also true about the characters that we read about, especially when their narrative form is in the first person, right? Like there's a lot of there's a lot of kind of questioning about the kind of authenticity of, or the kind of truth being told by a narrator who speaks in the first person. Not that I was trying to pull any kind of Nabokovian tricks or anything like that. I wasn't trying to have the reader constantly question the reality of what was going on, but merely to say that these are people telling their stories from their perspective, and their perspectives are naturally going to be biased and filtered. So that, yeah, you can never really truly say, you completely understand them. I don't know. To me, that just kind of, in my mind, that feels kind of the most authentic way to go about characterization, right? You can have people behave, you can have characters who behave logically and who proceed through a narrative in a very logical pattern that makes sense, but they still can always surprise you, I think, and in some cases surprise themselves too.
It's sort of like you don't have to be alone to be lonely.
Right, yeah, exactly. Or what is that story about Elvis, that like he was never so lonely as when he was surrounded in a room by other people? Yeah, for sure.
And they have that in spades.
Yeah. To their detriment, but I think also to the benefit of my being able to tell a story about them.
Agreed. I think that was the constant throughout the story, was that when they were in groups, as they told their own stories, they were at their loneliest points.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that.
That was a fascinating part of the book. Mm-hmm. Chapter to chapter, fluctuating from one to the other, even when they were writing about the other one themselves, talking about the other one themselves, mm-hmm. and the interactions that they had from each one's perspective. Mm-hmm. That constantly came through, but it does change towards the end of the book. It does change. Mm-hmm. And they seem to be starting to change. So that's why it would be.
Yeah, no, I like that you put it that way, because I am, a lot of times, like, we assume people change, and if they're going to change, especially in fiction, most of the time it's in some way for the better. So for me, like, I'm not, and that's why I ended the novel the way I did, was I'm less interested in how people change, I think, and more interested in the forces that either willingly or unwillingly push or compel someone to change their life. I mean, you could, and a reader could argue, like, we leave Sebastian and Oscar in a very positive scenario. I suppose if you were a real cynic, you could argue that maybe nothing does change. But that being said, I mean, so much of I'd much rather spend the bulk of my story trying to figure out, or to tell the reader, or to give the reader a sense of what are the forces that make someone change, rather than, okay, someone changed, here's how their life is better now.
No, I think you walk them through life experiences, and those experiences buffet them one way or the other, and they make progress, and then they lose progress. And
Mhm.
for every one step forward, there can be two steps back.
And is that
So,
not the story of our community, right? Like,
and everybody's lives.
yes, and everybody's lives, of course, of course.
Because when it comes right down to it, everybody is human, and humans, regardless of their orientation or their communities, experience human things.
Mhm.
So it makes it very universal, even if it is talking about two specific people from a specific community.
Oh, that's good to hear. That's good to hear. I feel like that's what I aspired to do. So thank you for saying that.
Well, then, congratulations. So on that note, we are winding down. I once again hope that you will visit us on stonewall-museum.org. Join us there, share information with us, come visit us here. We have the largest single exhibition we've ever had, which is Her Story, or the creation of the Woman's Fund, where we're looking to create parity in our library and archive between women and men. One of the first organizations to actually attempt to do that. This will now go on our shelves. So people can take it out here. You can buy it, I'm sure, at almost any place. And
yes,
that's
my publisher would not forgive me if I didn't mention that. Yes, you can also purchase it as well in paperback. So
in paperback, I'm glad we have hardcover.
yeah, there it is.
There it is. So join us, be part of our community, be part of our family. And as we get closer and closer to the end of the year, remember to vote. It is very important. Those of us in places like Florida are extraordinarily aware of how important votes are all across the country. So that is a special responsibility that we all have, and a citizenship responsibility that we must all do. So thank you for being with us. Zach, and a special thanks to you for writing the book and for sharing it with us. I'm hoping that people will take the time to read it. It is definitely worth reading. They are extraordinarily flawed and interesting characters.
Thank you so much, Robert.
And with that, we are finished. Have a good evening. See you soon.
Thanks again. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.